Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Salem, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. Salem, 1908. The city had already shaken off much of its infamous past. The witch trials, long relegated to history books, the maritime prosperity of its golden age faded into memory. But beneath Salem's modernizing veneer, where electric lights were replacing gas lamps and automobiles occasionally rattled down cobblestone streets, darker currents still flowed through certain corners of the city. The Adams estate stood on Chestnut Street, a stately Federal-style mansion built in 1804, its brick facade and white trim embodying the prosperity and respectability the family had cultivated for generations. Thaddeus Adams, then 62, was the last male descendant of a branch that had settled in Salem rather than following their more famous relatives to Quincy. A retired shipping merchant of modest wealth, Thaddeus was known throughout Salem as a reclusive but civic-minded gentleman who occasionally appeared at city functions, always impeccably dressed in suits that had fallen out of fashion a decade earlier. His wife, Minerva, had died in 1889, leaving him to raise their daughter, Josephine, who by 1908 was a spinster of 37. Neighbors described the pair as intensely private, polite when encountered on their infrequent walks through town, but never inviting visitors into their home. The household staff consisted only of Harriet Morton, a taciturn housekeeper in her 60s who had served the family since before Josephine's birth, and Everett Marsh, a groundskeeper who tended the extensive gardens but was only seen on the property 2 days each week. Salem Historical Society records indicate that the property had been in the Adams family since 1832, when it was purchased by Thaddeus's grandfather, Obadiah Adams, a cousin twice removed from President John Adams. What those public records did not mention, what existed only in private correspondence later discovered in the basement of the Salem Athenaeum, was the peculiar well located in the southeastern corner of the property, partially hidden by a copse of elm trees that predated even the Adams family's ownership. According to a letter dated April 17, 1908, written by Dr. Wesley Harrison to his colleague at Harvard Medical School, this well was not part of the property's original water system. The letter described it as roughly circular, approximately 8 feet in diameter, lined with fieldstone and covered by a wooden structure resembling a small gazebo, weathered gray with age. Dr. Harrison noted that unlike most wells in the region, which typically reached depths of 15 to 30 feet, before hitting the water table, the Adams well descended to an estimated depth of over 60 feet, based on his measurements during a social call to the property in 1906. The peculiarity of the well would have remained a mere curiosity, were it not for the events that began to unfold in early February of 1908. City records show that on February 12th, Thaddeus Adams filed a request with the Municipal Water Department to have his property connected to the city's relatively new water system, completed in 1896. The application, preserved in the Essex County Archives, specified that the connection was to replace existing well water, which has become unreliable and potentially contaminated. What makes this request noteworthy is that, according to the Salem Water Works Company's records, the Adams property had already been connected to the municipal water supply in 1899, shortly after the system had been extended to Chestnut Street. The house had not relied on well water for nearly a decade. Former Waterworks employee Martin Doyle, in a recorded interview conducted by the Salem Historical Society in 1951, recalled visiting the property following the request. Mr. Adams was agitated, Doyle remembered, kept insisting we inspect the existing pipes for leaks or contamination, said the water had developed an unusual taste and sometimes appeared cloudy. When I explained that any issue would be with the internal plumbing, not our supply, he became quite insistent that we check the well, which struck me as odd since they weren't using it anymore. Doyle's inspection found nothing amiss with the water supply to the house. He noted, however, that Mr. Adams had refused to let him examine the well, claiming abruptly that the matter was resolved and ushering him off the property. The next documented incident came on March 4th, when Salem police officer James Sullivan was summoned to the Adams property following reports from neighbors of unusual sounds in the night. The police report, terse and lacking in detail, simply states that Officer Sullivan found nothing suspicious and that Mr. Adams attributed the noises to ongoing repairs to address water damage in the cellar. What the report fails to mention, but what Sullivan later confided to his nephew, who recorded the account in his journal, was that Thaddeus Adams had appeared unusually disheveled, with soil staining his typically immaculate clothing, and that the officer had observed fresh scratches on the man's hands and forearms. Sullivan described Adams as unnervingly calm, despite his appearance, as if reading from a rehearsed statement when explaining the situation. More tellingly, Sullivan noted that while he was speaking with Adams on the front porch, he'd glimpsed Josephine watching from an upstairs window, her face showing signs of recent tears. When she realized she'd been spotted, she quickly withdrew from view. The next day, March 5th, Harriet Morton resigned her position with the Adams household after more than 40 years of service. No formal reason was recorded, but the baker's delivery boy reported that when he arrived that morning, he'd seen the elderly housekeeper leaving with a small case, muttering prayers under her breath, and refusing to look back at the house. Throughout March and April, neighbors reported increased activity around the well. Deliveries of lumber, canvas sheeting, and quantities of lime arrived at the property. Everett Marsh, the groundskeeper, was now seen daily, often working late into the evening by lantern light. When questioned by curious neighbors, he would claim they were simply renovating the old well house, though no one could recall the structure ever being used or maintained in previous years. The most detailed account of this period comes from Catherine Whitaker, a widowed neighbor whose second-floor sewing room afforded a partial view of the Adams property. In her journal, she documented seeing Thaddeus and Josephine making frequent trips to the well house, sometimes carrying bundles of cloth or small wooden boxes. On several occasions, she noted that their visits occurred well after midnight, with only the faint glow of a lantern marking their progress across the darkened grounds. There is something deeply unsettling in their manner, she wrote on April 22nd. Thaddeus moves with the stiff determination of a man fulfilling an obligation, while Josephine follows like one in a trance. Yesterday I observed her at the edge of the well house, her hands pressed to her ears as if to block out some sound, while her father worked inside. When she removed her hands and raised her face to the sky, her expression was one of such profound anguish that I found myself backing away from my window, ashamed to witness such private distress. The turning point came on the night of April 30th, Walpurgis night on the old calendar, though this connection may be merely coincidental. At approximately 11:45 p.m., residents of Chestnut Street were awakened by what multiple witnesses described as an agonized scream, neither fully human nor animal, emanating from the Adams property. George Lambert, a neighbor returning late from a meeting of the Freemasons, reported seeing Thaddeus Adams running from the direction of the well house toward the main house. His white shirt darkened with what appeared to be water or some other liquid. No one called the police. As Catherine Whitaker later explained to investigators, in a neighborhood such as ours, one does not intrude on private matters, no matter how concerning they may appear. This cultural reticence would prove to have dire consequences. The following morning, May 1st, Josephine Adams was seen walking to the post office shortly after it opened at 8 a.m., where she mailed several letters. The postal clerk, Edwin Porter, recalled that she appeared composed but distant, and was dressed entirely in black, as if in mourning, though no death in the family had been announced. She returned directly to the house and was not seen again that day. By evening, residents noticed that no lights were visible in the Adams house, unusual, as the parlor lamps were typically lit at dusk. The next morning, when neither Thaddeus nor Josephine appeared, and the daily milk delivery remained uncollected on the front step, neighbor William Proctor finally summoned the police. Officers James Sullivan and Henry Dawes arrived at approximately 10:30 a.m. on May 2nd. Their initial knocks went unanswered, but finding the front door unlocked, they entered the house. The police report describes the interior as immaculate and orderly, with no signs of struggle or disturbance. However, there was no trace of either Thaddeus or Josephine Adams. A search of the house revealed several curious details. In Thaddeus's study, an open ledger displayed recently penned calculations of depth and volume, alongside a crude diagram of what appeared to be the well structure. In Josephine's bedroom, officers found her wardrobe and personal effects untouched, but discovered a journal hidden beneath her mattress. The journal, now preserved in the Salem Police Archives, provides the most disturbing insights into the events preceding the disappearance. The entries, dating back to January 1908, begin with oblique references to Father's increasing preoccupation with what lies below, and the voices he claims to hear rising from the darkness. By February, Josephine's entries had become more explicit. Father insists the well is speaking to him, not with words, he says, but with a kind of knowledge that fills his mind when he stands above it. He has forbidden me to approach it alone. The entry from February 23rd reads, Father brought home the old records today, property maps from before our family's ownership of the house. He was greatly agitated to discover that the well does not appear on any of them. He is now convinced that Grandfather Obadiah had it dug for some purpose he never disclosed to the family. By late March, Josephine's writing shows increasing alarm. Father spent the entire night at the well house. When he returned this morning, his shoes were soaked, and he spoke of confirming what I've long suspected. When I asked what he meant, he only smiled and said, It doesn't end, Josie. The shaft continues far deeper than anyone could have dug it. He claims to have lowered a weighted line nearly 120 feet without finding bottom. The most chilling entry comes from April 28th, just 2 days before the screams were heard. I can no longer deny that something is terribly wrong with the well. Today, while Father was in town, I approached it alone, despite his warnings. The water level has risen dramatically, almost to the surface, though we've had no significant rainfall. The liquid, I hesitate to call it water, has a viscous quality and a faint iridescence in certain light. Worse, when I dropped a small stone into it, the ripples moved in a most unnatural way, as if flowing back toward the center rather than outward. I stood watching, transfixed, until I became aware of a sound, a soft, rhythmic pulsation coming from deep below, like a distant heartbeat. I fled back to the house and have been shaking ever since. Father must seal it up. Whatever it is, it must be sealed away. The final entry, dated April 30th, contains just one line. Father says we must feed it. May God forgive us. The police investigation initially focused on the possibility that the Adams had fled, perhaps due to financial troubles or other personal difficulties. However, all their personal identification documents were found in the house, and their bank accounts showed no recent large withdrawals. Inquiries to relatives in Boston and Quincy revealed that no one had heard from either Thaddeus or Josephine. It was not until May 4th that investigators turned their attention to the well house. Officer Dawes's report describes the structure as recently reinforced, with new wooden supports and a heavy padlock securing the door. After breaking the lock, they found the interior unexpectedly dry and clean, with a new wooden platform built around the well opening. The platform featured a complex system of pulleys attached to a hand-cranked winch. Most disturbing was the discovery of a leather-bound book placed carefully on the platform beside the well. The book, which appeared to be several hundred years old, contained handwritten text in Latin with annotations in English in what was identified as Thaddeus Adams's handwriting. Experts from Harvard later identified the text as an obscure treatise on subterranean waterways, dating to the early 17th century. When officers peered into the well itself, they reported that the water level was unusually high, almost to the brim, and had an oily sheen and unnatural stillness. Attempts to measure the depth using a weighted line proved inconsistent, with the weight sometimes appearing to rest on a solid bottom at around 30 feet, and other times continuing to descend well beyond 100 feet with no resistance felt. Water samples were collected and sent to laboratories at both Harvard and MIT, though the official reports from these tests have been mysteriously absent from all public records. An unofficial note from a laboratory assistant found decades later in the personal effects of Officer Dawes stated only that the liquid defies standard analysis and that certain organic compounds present cannot be identified through known methods. The investigation into the disappearance of Thaddeus and Josephine Adams continued for several weeks, but yielded no conclusive evidence of their fate. With no bodies found and no signs of violence, the case was eventually classified as an unexplained disappearance, one of many such mysteries in Salem's long history. The Adams property remained vacant for nearly 2 years, tied up in probate court as distant relatives contested ownership. Eventually, in March 1910, the house was sold to James and Eleanor Winthrop, who undertook extensive renovations, including the demolition of the well house and the filling in of the well with concrete and gravel. The story might have ended there, forgotten among the many historical curiosities of Salem, if not for what happened during the excavation for a new garden on the property in the summer of 1957, nearly 5 decades later. Workers digging near the site of the former well uncovered a small metal box buried approximately 3 feet below the surface. Inside was a sealed glass jar containing a letter, written in what handwriting experts later confirmed was Josephine Adams's distinctive script. The letter, dated April 30th, 1908, reads, "To whoever finds this, I pray it is someone of sound mind and strong constitution, for what I must relate defies rational explanation. The well on this property is not what it appears. It was never meant to provide water, but to contain something that must never be released. My great-grandfather Obadiah discovered it quite by accident while digging a conventional well in 1832. When his workers broke through into what appeared to be a natural cavern, they found the shaft already there, lined with stone of a type not native to New England, descending into unimaginable darkness. Family records, kept secret until now, indicate that 3 workers who first entered the shaft never returned. A 4th emerged in a state of such extreme terror that he could not speak coherently for weeks, and when he finally did, his tales were dismissed as madness. He died by his own hand shortly thereafter. Obadiah, driven by scientific curiosity that overwhelmed his caution, continued to investigate. He discovered that the shaft's depth varied inexplicably, and that the water level rose and fell, not with the seasons or rainfall, but according to some other unknowable cycle. He became convinced that the well connected to some vast subterranean network that could not be mapped by conventional means. More disturbing were his observations of the water itself. In certain journals, which my father recently discovered hidden in a compartment of Obadiah's desk, he described witnessing the water move against gravity, flowing upward along the shaft walls before receding. He wrote of sounds emanating from the depths, not the dripping or flowing of normal water, but sounds that he reluctantly described as almost vocal in nature. Most alarmingly, he documented a series of inexplicable events on the property. Livestock that refused to approach the area around the well, plants that grew with unnatural rapidity when watered from it, only to wither and blacken within days, birds that fell from the sky when flying directly overhead. Obadiah eventually sealed the well and built the structure around it, ostensibly as an ornamental garden feature, but in reality to ensure no one would accidentally access the shaft. He passed the truth to his son, my grandfather, who in turn told my father only on his deathbed. For decades, the well remained sealed and forgotten. But this past winter, after prolonged rains, My father noticed water seeping into our cellar, water with an iridescent quality that seemed to move with purpose rather than simply flowing downhill. Investigating, he found that the old seal on the well had deteriorated, and that whatever lies at the bottom was once again making its presence known. What began as an effort to reseal the well became something far more sinister. My father spent increasing amounts of time at the site, at first taking measurements and making drawings, later simply sitting for hours, staring into its depths. He began to change, subtle shifts in his personality, increasing secrecy, periods of disorientation followed by frightening clarity. He spoke of dreams in which he descended the shaft, not into water, but into a vast, lightless space where something ancient waited. He became convinced that the well was not merely a passage, but a boundary between our world and something else, something that had been imprisoned there long before human memory. Last week he told me he had been communicating with it, that it was lonely, hungry, that it had chosen our family as its caretakers, and, in return for certain accommodations, it would share knowledge beyond human comprehension. I tried to reason with him, to seek medical help, but he grew only more determined. Last night he insisted I accompany him to the well at midnight. What I witnessed there, what emerged partially from the water, reaching with appendages that seemed to phase between solid and liquid states, I cannot fully describe without sensing my mind beginning to fracture. My father embraced it willingly. I fled, but I know it is not finished. I hear it calling to me even as I write this. My father's voice is among the others now, promising that there is no pain, only transformation. I am going back to the well tonight, not to surrender, but to end this. I have gathered every chemical from Father's laboratory that might be flammable. If you are reading this, know that I tried to destroy it. If I failed, I beg you to finish what I started. Fill the shaft with stone, with concrete, with anything that will seal it away. Do not look into the water. Do not listen to the voices. They lie. Josephine Adams. The Winthrop family, understandably disturbed by the discovery, turned the letter over to local authorities, who treated it as a historical curiosity rather than evidence of any crime. Psychological experts consulted on the case suggested that the letter represented the delusions of a troubled mind, perhaps explaining the disappearance as a case of shared psychosis between father and daughter. The matter receded from public attention once again, but over the subsequent decades, residents of the property reported occasional peculiarities, unexplained dampness in the area of the former well despite adequate drainage, electronic equipment failing inexplicably in certain parts of the garden, pets refusing to enter the southeastern corner of the yard. In 1986, during the installation of a swimming pool, workers broke through into what appeared to be a hollow space beneath the concrete cap that had sealed the old well. Water immediately began to fill the excavation, forcing an emergency evacuation of the site. Analysis showed the water contained unusual concentrations of minerals typically found only in deep aquifers, along with trace organic compounds that defied standard classification. The swimming pool project was abandoned, the excavation refilled, and a more substantial concrete cap installed. The current owners have landscaped over the area entirely, creating a rose garden with a circular stone path that precisely outlines where the well once stood. To this day, however, gardeners report that plants within that circle exhibit strange growth patterns, flourishing with unusual vigor before suddenly wilting. Visitors occasionally mention a feeling of unease when standing at the center of the circle, with some describing a subtle vibration coming through the soles of their shoes, as if something far below were still moving, still waiting. The disappearance of Thaddeus and Josephine Adams remains officially unsolved. Their names are occasionally mentioned in tours of Salem's historic mysteries, alongside the more famous witch trials and maritime legends. Most historians attribute their vanishing to mundane causes, perhaps a planned disappearance, a journey that ended in unreported tragedy, or even a secret relocation to avoid some scandal now lost to time. But for those who have read Josephine's letter, who have stood on that circular stone path and felt the subtle wrongness of the ground beneath their feet, there remains the unsettling possibility that some boundaries were never meant to be crossed, some depths never meant to be plumbed, and that beneath the carefully maintained normality of Salem's historic streets, ancient and unfathomable things still wait in darkness. The Adams well has been sealed for over a century now, but those who know the story still wonder, is a concrete cap and a century of silence enough to contain whatever found its way to the surface in that spring of 1908? Or is it merely waiting, patient beyond human comprehension, for the next curious soul to peer too deeply into Salem's buried histories? While official investigations ceased long ago, some in Salem still quietly researched the Adams case. Among them was Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, a hydrologist at Salem State University, who became fascinated with the unusual properties reported in the well water samples. In 2012, she managed to obtain permission to take soil core samples from the Rose Garden area. Her findings, published in an obscure academic journal and largely ignored by mainstream science, documented anomalous soil conditions extending far deeper than the known depth of the original well. More disturbing were the trace elements she detected, compounds that, according to her analysis, could not have formed under normal terrestrial conditions. The molecular structures suggest synthesis under extreme pressure, she wrote, consistent with depths of several miles below the Earth's surface, despite being found mere feet below the garden soil. Dr. Blackwood's research came to an abrupt end when her laboratory suffered a catastrophic flood in 2013, destroying most of her samples and equipment. University officials attributed it to a burst water main, though maintenance records show no reported pipe failures in that building. Dr. Blackwood took an indefinite leave of absence shortly thereafter and reportedly relocated to Arizona, as far from the Atlantic Ocean as practicable. In 2015, during renovations to expand the Salem Public Library's archives, workers discovered a previously unknown sub-basement area containing several boxes of documents related to the Adams case. Among them was a partial transcript of an interview with Harriet Morton, the Adams family's housekeeper, who had abruptly resigned just before their disappearance. The interview, conducted in 1912 by a private investigator hired by Adams family relatives, contains Morton's first public statements about the events she witnessed. I served the Adams family faithfully for over 40 years and never had cause for complaint until that last winter. Mr. Thaddeus had always been a rational, God-fearing man, but after he began his examinations of that wretched well, a darkness came over him. At first it was small things. He'd stop in mid-conversation, head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. Then came the changes to his routine. He who had never risen before 7 began waking at all hours, sometimes standing at his bedroom window in the dead of night, staring out toward the well house. Miss Josephine noticed it too, poor dear. She'd ask me if I thought her father was ill, if perhaps a doctor should be called. But he'd have none of it, flew into a terrible rage when she suggested it at breakfast one morning. Then there was the business with the water. He became obsessed with it, collecting samples from the well in glass jars, lining them up in his study and staring at them for hours. I once observed him place a small silver coin in one of the jars. When I returned to clean the next day, the coin was gone, though the jar was still sealed. When I mentioned this, he merely smiled and said, "It knows what belongs to the depths." The final straw came in early March. I was awakened by sounds from the kitchen, a splashing and a soft, wet footfall. Thinking a pipe might have burst, I lit a candle and went to investigate. There I found Mr. Thaddeus standing at the sink, his clothing soaked through, though it hadn't been raining. The sink was filled with water that had a strange, oily sheen to it, and floating in it, I swear on my mother's grave, were tiny things that looked like miniature hands, no larger than a child's fingernail, opening and closing as if grasping at the air. When he saw me, he calmly emptied the sink and dried his hands, as if nothing unusual had occurred. The well water has special properties, he told me, properties that could change everything we understand about the natural world. Then he looked at me with eyes that seemed somehow different, darker, with a quality I cannot describe except to say they no longer looked fully human. I gave my notice the very next day. Some things no wage is worth witnessing, and I fear that whatever happened to the Adams family was something no mortal was meant to comprehend. The interview notes indicate that Morton died less than a month after giving this testimony, from what her doctor described as natural causes accelerated by extreme nervous exhaustion. Further discoveries in the library archives included correspondence between Thaddeus Adams and various academic figures in the months leading up to the disappearance. Most notable was an exchange with Professor Walter Griffin of Miskatonic University in Arkham, Massachusetts, a scholar of comparative mythology who had published several controversial papers on water cults in pre-Columbian New England. In a letter dated January 18, 1908, Adams wrote, "Your treatise on subterranean waterways as pathways to alternate realms has proven most illuminating, particularly in light of certain discoveries on my property. The indigenous legends you cite regarding the dark waters that flow both ways bear striking resemblance to phenomena I have observed. I am especially intrigued by your mention of ceremonial wells that were said to serve not as sources of water, but as doors or mouths through which offerings could be presented to entities dwelling in some lightless realm below. While scientific rationality demands skepticism toward such primitive superstitions, I find myself increasingly unable to dismiss the possibility that our ancestors possessed knowledge that modern science has yet to rediscover. The anomalous properties of the liquid drawn from my well, its variable density, its apparent ability to dissolve certain metals while leaving others untouched, and, most curiously, the transient formations that sometimes appear in it under specific conditions of temperature and light, suggest characteristics inconsistent with ordinary groundwater. I would greatly value your expert opinion on these matters and would be pleased to host you at my home in Salem should your academic schedule permit a brief consultation." Griffin's reply, dated February 3rd, urgently advised Adams to cease his investigations and to seal the well immediately. He wrote, "Some doorways, once opened, cannot be easily closed again. The patterns you describe are consistent with those recorded in the final journal entries of Dr. Ambrose Pierce before his disappearance near Centralville in 1883. Whatever you have discovered, I implore you, do not attempt further contact." There is no record of whether Griffin ever visited the Adams property, though train ticketing records show he purchased passage to Salem in late April 1908, just days before the Adams family disappeared. The most recent development in the long, strange history of the Adams well came in September 2021, when unprecedented rainfall from Hurricane Ida caused widespread flooding throughout Essex County. Residents of Chestnut Street reported that while most properties suffered water damage from the overwhelmed storm drains, the former Adams property, now owned by the Whitmore family, remained completely dry. More unusual still, neighbors observed that in the center of the rose garden, precisely where the old well had been located, the ground appeared to be actively absorbing water from the surrounding area, with small rivulets flowing uphill against gravity toward the central point. City engineers who investigated the phenomenon attributed it to unusual subsurface drainage patterns and recommended additional groundwater monitoring for the area. Their equipment, installed in October 2021, recorded normal conditions for approximately 6 weeks before all sensors within a 30-foot radius of the former well location ceased transmitting data simultaneously on the night of December 21st, the winter solstice. The monitoring project was quietly abandoned after 3 separate technicians reported equipment malfunction. The official report cited probable soil conductivity issues as the cause, though one technician later claimed off the record that the final data transmission showed moisture levels dropping to 0 in an instant, as if something had simply consumed all available water in the surrounding soil. As our investigation into the Adams well continues, We must acknowledge that certain patterns extend beyond the property itself, suggesting a more widespread phenomenon that has shaped Salem's history in subtle yet profound ways. Historical records reveal that in the decades following the Addams family's disappearance, a series of unusual water-related incidents occurred throughout Salem, forming a pattern that few have recognized until now. In 1912, just 4 years after Thaddeus and Josephine vanished, the Salem Water Commission documented unprecedented fluctuations in pressure throughout the municipal system, particularly in pipes running beneath Chestnut Street and its surrounding neighborhoods. Engineers attributed these anomalies to settlement of the aging infrastructure, but internal memos, recently declassified and available in the Essex County Archives, tell a different story. Commission engineer Wallace Porter wrote to his supervisor on June 17, 1912, "The pressure variations follow no pattern consistent with normal usage or mechanical failure. Most disturbing is the directionality. Instruments indicate flow reversals occurring at precise intervals, as if something were drawing water back through the system toward some central point." Even more concerning, water samples taken during these events show elevated mineral content consistent with deep groundwater, despite our system drawing exclusively from surface reservoirs. Porter's reports grew increasingly urgent throughout that summer, culminating in a final memo dated September 3rd. "I can no longer attribute these phenomena to any conventional explanation. During last night's monitoring, pressure gauges at Station 7 registered a complete reversal lasting approximately 17 minutes. The water's subsequent chemical analysis shows compounds I cannot identify. I strongly recommend we consult with specialists from MIT regarding potential geological factors." No response to this recommendation appears in the archives, and Porter himself requested a transfer to the Boston Water Authority the following month. His subsequent correspondence makes no mention of the Salem anomalies, suggesting either resolution of his concerns or, perhaps more likely, an unwillingness to pursue questions that threatened his professional credibility. The pattern repeated in 1931 when residents along the eastern end of Chestnut Street reported water from their taps running briefly but distinctly red-tinged during the early morning hours of May 1st, exactly 23 years after the Addams disappearance. Health Department officials attributed the discoloration to rust in the pipes, though testing showed no elevated iron levels. Instead, the water contained trace amounts of an unidentified organic compound that one chemist's notes described as structurally similar to hemoglobin, yet with molecular arrangements inconsistent with any known terrestrial organism. No illness resulted from exposure to this water, but several residents who consumed it reported unusually vivid dreams in the following nights, often featuring deep water and voices speaking in languages they could not identify. These accounts, dismissed as hysteria at the time, were documented by Dr. Margaret Hollis, a psychologist who had developed an interest in collective delusions following the infamous dancing sickness that had affected young women in a local shoe factory the previous winter. Dr. Hollis's papers, preserved in the Salem State University archives, include interview transcripts revealing striking similarities in the dream experiences. Patients report standing at the edge of a vast body of water that they somehow recognize as being underground. The water appears black yet simultaneously reflective, showing them distorted versions of themselves. From beneath the surface, voices call to them by name, promising revelations of profound knowledge in exchange for joining with the depths. Most disturbing is the consistent report that these voices somehow speak directly into their thoughts without sound, yet are described as ancient and multitudinous, as if many beings were speaking as one. By 1954, the pattern had become more pronounced. That spring, workers expanding Salem's sewer system beneath Essex Street, which runs perpendicular to Chestnut Street, approximately half a mile from the Addams property, uncovered what appeared to be an old stone-lined tunnel. Unlike typical colonial-era construction, this tunnel featured unusually precise stonework with no visible mortar between the blocks, each fitted with mathematical precision. The tunnel, running east to west, was partially flooded with water that city engineer Howard Marsh described in his report as possessing unusual refractive properties, bending light in a manner that made depth perception extremely difficult. Marsh noted that the passage appeared to slope gently downward as it continued westward in the direction of Chestnut Street. Photographs taken during the initial excavation show a tunnel approximately 7 feet in height, with walls composed of greenish-gray stone, unlike any native to the region. More curious were the markings visible on these stones, intricate patterns that resembled writing, though in no language the archaeological consultants could identify. The official record indicates that after preliminary documentation, the tunnel was determined to be of no historical significance and was sealed with concrete as excavation continued around it. However, personal journals kept by Samuel Weatherby, one of the workers on the project, tell a different story. Weatherby, whose great-granddaughter donated his papers to the Salem Historical Society in 2017, wrote on April 17, 1954, "Mason and Peters went about 50 yards down the passage today while the engineers were at lunch. They came back white as sheets, refusing to say what they'd seen. Later, after a few drinks at Quinn's, Peters said they'd reached a point where the tunnel suddenly opened into a much larger space. Like a cathedral underground," he said. "The water was deeper there, up to their waists, and freezing cold despite the mild weather above. What spooked them was the sound, a low pulsing hum that seemed to come from the water itself, vibrating through their bodies. Mason said it made his fillings hurt, and his thoughts feel slippery. They turned back when they noticed the water level rising around them, seemingly flowing in from nowhere. Peters swears it rose nearly a foot in seconds, and that as they waded back toward the entrance, he felt something brush against his leg. Not like a fish, he insisted, more like fingers, gentle at first, then trying to grip. The foremans ordered the tunnel sealed tomorrow, just as well. None of us wants anything more to do with it." Weatherby's journal entries over the subsequent weeks describe increasing tension among the crew, with several men quitting without explanation. His final entry regarding the tunnel, dated May 3rd, notes, "Marsh brought in some government types today, not local authorities, men in suits who didn't give their department. They took all our photographs and had us sign some papers, told us the tunnel was actually an old military installation and that discussing it would violate national security. That's nonsense. It's clearly older than anything military in these parts. But the bonus they paid for our silence spends just fine." The tunnel was indeed sealed the following day, with no mention of it appearing in any official city planning documents or historical records. Its existence would have remained completely unknown were it not for Weatherby's private writings. The next significant incident occurred in 1977, when the newly constructed Salem State College Science Building experienced a bizarre aquatic infiltration. During renovation of the basement level for additional laboratory space, workers breached what appeared to be a natural underground spring. What made this discovery unusual was its location, nearly half a mile from any known water source, and flowing with sufficient force to flood the entire basement level within hours. Water analysis showed extreme mineral content consistent with very deep aquifers, along with several compounds that defied immediate identification. More puzzling was the direction of flow. Measurements indicated the water was moving horizontally rather than upward, as if flowing through an underground channel from somewhere else. Dr. Vincent Petrowski, a geologist called in to consult, recommended extensive ground-penetrating radar surveys of the area. His preliminary findings, documented in a report to the college administration dated November 12, 1977, identified what appeared to be a network of channels or tunnels running throughout Salem's bedrock, converging in the vicinity of, perhaps not surprisingly, Chestnut Street. "These formations do not appear natural," Petrowski wrote, yet predating any colonial construction. "The regularity of their arrangement suggests deliberate design, yet their depth and extent would have required engineering capabilities far beyond what was available to early settlers. Most curious is their relationship to modern Salem. They appear to run beneath or adjacent to all major historical sites in the city, as if the surface development followed some pre-existing underground pattern. Petrowski's full survey was never completed. College records indicate the project was canceled due to budget constraints, though Petrowski's personal correspondence suggests more troubling reasons. In a letter to a colleague at MIT, he wrote, "Something about this project has become deeply unsettling. Equipment malfunctions whenever we focus on certain areas. 3 separate radar units have failed in identical ways. My graduate assistant, after reviewing the initial data, abruptly withdrew from the program and left town without explanation. Most disturbing are the dreams I've begun having. Vivid visions of vast underwater chambers beneath Salem, filled with architecture that follows geometric principles I cannot quite comprehend while awake." Petrowski took a sabbatical the following semester and subsequently transferred to the University of Arizona. His research interests shifted from hydrogeology to desert formations, and he never published his findings on Salem's underground waterways. The spring beneath the science building was eventually sealed with concrete and the basement renovated as originally planned. However, maintenance reports from subsequent decades note persistent moisture problems in that section of the building, with water inexplicably seeping through seemingly solid concrete during certain times of the year, particularly in late April and early May. More recent events suggest that whatever lies beneath Salem, whether natural phenomenon or something less easily categorized, remains active. In 2001, during construction of a new parking structure near the Peabody-Essex Museum, excavation uncovered a circular stone chamber approximately 12 feet in diameter, its walls lined with the same distinctive greenish-gray stone observed in the 1954 tunnel discovery. Museum archaeologist Dr. Eliza Chen, who documented the site before construction continued, noted several peculiarities. The chamber appears to be a node or junction point with smaller tunnels radiating outward like spokes from a wheel. Most have collapsed or been deliberately sealed with more recent stonework, likely during colonial times. The craftsmanship of the original structure, however, exhibits precision that would be challenging to achieve even with modern tools. Carbon dating of organic material found embedded in the mortar suggests construction approximately 400 years ago, yet the architectural style matches no known colonial or indigenous building techniques from that era. Most intriguing was the central feature of the chamber, a circular well-like structure, its depth obscured by accumulated groundwater. Initial measurements suggested a depth of at least 40 feet, though when attempts were made to drain it for further examination, the water level remained constant despite hours of pumping. Dr. Chen's report, submitted to both the museum administration and the Salem Historical Commission, recommended extensive archaeological investigation before construction continued. Her recommendations were initially approved, but within days, the decision was mysteriously reversed. The chamber was hastily documented with photographs and laser scanning, then filled with concrete as the parking structure construction proceeded according to the original timeline. In her personal journal, later donated to the museum archives after her death in 2019, Chen expressed profound frustration with this decision. "I cannot fathom why the commission reversed course so abruptly. The chamber represents potentially the most significant archaeological find in Salem's history, evidence of sophisticated engineering predating colonial settlement, yet clearly not indigenous in origin. Who built these structures? For what purpose? These questions may now never be answered. I cannot shake the feeling that certain influences were brought to bear on this situation." Commissioner Whitmore was particularly adamant about proceeding with construction, citing concerns about project delays and costs. Yet his family's historical connection to Chestnut Street, mere blocks from this discovery, suggests potential conflicts of interest that were never addressed. The Whitmore family connection adds yet another layer to our investigation, creating a thread that runs from the early 20th century to the present day. Historical records confirm that Richard Whitmore's great-grandfather, Josiah Whitmore, was a business associate of Thaddeus Adams, the two men having jointly invested in several commercial shipping ventures in the early 1900s. More significantly, Josiah Whitmore was one of the last people known to have visited the Adams home before the family's disappearance. Police interviews from May 1908 include a statement from Whitmore acknowledging a brief meeting with Thaddeus on April 29th, ostensibly to discuss a pending investment. Whitmore described Adams as uncharacteristically animated, speaking rapidly about some discovery that would transform our understanding of natural law. He insisted I return the following evening to observe a demonstration, but pressing business in Boston prevented my attendance. That pressing business provided Whitmore with a convenient alibi when the Adams family vanished. More intriguing is what happened in the aftermath. Whitmore's shipping company suddenly acquired several lucrative contracts previously held by Adams Enterprises, effectively doubling his wealth within months of his associate's disappearance. The Whitmore family subsequently became prominent in Salem's business and political spheres, with members serving on various municipal boards and commissions throughout the decades. They never attempted to acquire the Adams property, however, maintaining a careful distance from it until Richard Whitmore's purchase in 2020, more than a century after his great-grandfather's fateful meeting with Thaddeus Adams. This connection raises troubling questions. Did Josiah Whitmore know more about the Adams disappearance than he revealed to authorities? Has knowledge of the well's true nature been passed down through generations of the Whitmore family? Is the current restoration of the well part of some long-planned initiative, its timing deliberately aligned with historical patterns? We may find partial answers in the experiences of those who have encountered the current incarnation of the Adams well. Now restored as the centerpiece of the Whitmore family's rose garden, 3 individuals who attended a wellness retreat at the property in early 2023 have spoken anonymously about their experiences, providing accounts that align disturbingly with historical descriptions. One participant, a 42-year-old technology executive from Boston, described being invited after expressing interest in alternative healing practices at a corporate networking event attended by Richard Whitmore. The invitation seemed exclusive. Whitmore mentioned that they only host small groups of receptive individuals for their water therapy sessions. The event was presented as a combination of meditation, hydrotherapy, and what he called molecular restructuring, though he was vague about the specifics. Upon arrival, we were led through a series of relaxation exercises in the garden, gradually moving closer to the well house at the center. The roses surrounding it were unlike any I'd seen, massive blooms with an almost translucent quality to the petals, and a scent that was initially pleasant but became almost disorienting in its intensity. Inside the well house, Richard's wife Sarah led a meditation focused on connecting with the deeper currents that flow beneath conscious thought. The well itself was covered with an ornate wooden lid, intricately carved with patterns that seemed to shift slightly whenever I tried to focus on them. An optical illusion, I assumed at the time. The culmination of the experience involved each participant drinking a small vial of water drawn directly from the well. Sarah performed this with ceremonial precision, lowering a silver cup on a chain into the darkness below, then carefully decanting the liquid into crystal vials. The water had a faint opalescence and tasted unlike any mineral water I've encountered, slightly sweet yet with a metallic aftercast that lingered for hours. The immediate effect was a sensation of warmth spreading outward from my stomach, followed by a peculiar clarity of thought that felt both exhilarating and somehow troubling, as if parts of my mind that normally maintained healthy barriers had suddenly become permeable. That night in my hotel room, I experienced what I can only describe as waking dreams, vivid images of vast underwater spaces where light behaved according to unfamiliar physics. I felt simultaneously terrified and fascinated, as if I were being shown aspects of reality that human minds aren't equipped to process. Most disturbing was the sense of presence, a consciousness that seemed to observe me through these visions, ancient and vast and utterly inhuman in its perspective. It communicated without words, conveying concepts that my waking mind couldn't retain except as fragmentary impressions of tremendous depth, both physical and temporal. I woke the next morning with a powerful thirst and a lingering sense of incompleteness, as if I'd glimpsed something profound, but been unable to fully grasp it. Within days, I found myself thinking constantly about the experience, researching Salem's history, and even considering purchasing property nearby. Richard Whitmore has contacted me twice since then, inquiring about my integration process and suggesting that regular exposure to the water leads to accelerated transformation. He's invited me to join what he calls their inner circle, apparently a group that meets monthly at the well house. I've neither accepted nor declined, but I find myself drawn to the idea in ways that both intrigue and alarm me. Another participant, a medical researcher from New York, reported similar experiences, but with more pronounced physiological effects. Within hours of consuming the water, I noticed unusual sensations, a slight tingling in my extremities, enhanced sensory perception, and what I can only describe as an awareness of my own cellular processes. As someone with medical training, I found myself cataloging these effects with professional curiosity, even as another part of me registered growing concern. The effects persisted for nearly a week, gradually diminishing, but leaving subtle changes in their wake. My sleep patterns altered, requiring fewer hours, but featuring intensely vivid dreams. Blood work ordered by my personal physician showed several anomalies: elevated levels of certain trace minerals, unusual patterns in my electrolyte balance, and most concerning, subtle alterations in my cerebrospinal fluid chemistry that have no clear medical explanation. Most disturbing has been the persistent sense of connection to something distant, yet intimately linked to my physical being. I sometimes wake at night with the absolute certainty that something is calling to me, pulling me towards Salem with an urgency that defies rational explanation. I've found myself researching property values in the area, particularly focusing on locations with deep wells or natural springs, despite having no previous interest in relocating. Richard Whitmore has remained in contact, sending me small vials of what he calls maintenance doses through a private courier service. I've had these analyzed by a laboratory colleague, discreetly, without explanation of their source. The results were puzzling enough that he ran the tests 3 times, ultimately concluding that while the liquid is primarily water, it contains complex organic compounds with molecular structures unlike anything in their reference database. I've stopped consuming these maintenance doses, storing them instead for future analysis. Since making that decision, I've experienced what can only be described as withdrawal symptoms: intense thirst that no ordinary water seems to satisfy, migraines that correspond to lunar cycles, and dreams of drowning that leave me gasping awake, my sheets soaked not with sweat, but with what appears to be normal water that seems to exude directly from my skin. Its effect suggests some form of progressive biochemical restructuring that may not be immediately harmful, but is undeniably transformative in ways medical science cannot yet categorize. The third witness, an architectural historian who visited the property as part of research for a book on Salem's historical buildings, provided the most detailed description of the well house itself. The structure appears outwardly to be a faithful reproduction of period garden architecture, consistent with the federal style of the main house. Whatever the Whitmores are distributing from that well, I can state with professional certainty that it is not simply water, nor any known therapeutic compound. However, closer examination reveals subtle inconsistencies, proportions that create unsettling optical effects, corners that seem slightly non-Euclidean when viewed peripherally, acoustic properties that dampen external sound while amplifying the faint liquid movements from the well below. The interior contains elements that are definitely not consistent with early 19th century design. The wooden platform surrounding the well opening incorporates intricate inlaid patterns using materials I couldn't readily identify. Not quite metal, not quite stone, with an iridescent quality that changes depending on viewing angle. Most notably, the well itself defies conventional architectural logic. The opening appears to be approximately 3 feet in diameter, lined with the same fieldstone described in historical accounts. However, when I dropped a small pebble to gauge its depth, the sound that returned suggested dimensions inconsistent with the structure's exterior proportions, as if the shaft expanded significantly below ground level. I attempted to take measurements and photographs for my research, but experienced equipment failures that Mr. Whitmore dismissed as common occurrences around the well. My laser measuring device gave wildly inconsistent readings, while my digital camera captured only blurred images despite perfect lighting conditions. What I found most disturbing, however, was the effect the space had on my spatial perception. After approximately 10 minutes inside the well house, I began experiencing a sensation that the room was subtly larger on the inside than its exterior dimensions would allow. Not dramatically so, but enough to create a persistent cognitive dissonance that became increasingly uncomfortable. When I mentioned this sensation to Mrs. Whitmore, who had accompanied me on the tour, she smiled in a manner I can only describe as knowing, and said, "The well creates its own space. It always has." When I pressed for clarification, she changed the subject, but her comment suggested a familiarity with the phenomenon that implied it was neither unexpected nor concerning to them. Before leaving, I was offered what was described as collected condensation from the well house interior, a small vial of clear liquid that Mrs. Whitmore suggested would enhance my understanding of the property's unique architectural energy. I accepted out of professional courtesy, but disposed of it unopened, after experiencing a profound sense of unease whenever I considered consuming it. In my 20 years of architectural research, I have encountered many spaces with unusual properties, buildings with exceptional acoustics, structures that create optical illusions, historical sites that evoke strong emotional responses. The Whitmore Well House is qualitatively different from any of these. It feels engineered to affect human perception and cognition in very specific ways, using principles that seem to extend beyond conventional architecture into domains I'm not qualified to assess. These testimonies, while subjective, establish a consistent pattern that aligns with historical accounts dating back to the original Addams family disappearance. Something associated with the well, whether the water itself or some other factor, appears to induce both physiological and psychological changes in those exposed to it, creating a sense of connection to something ancient and not fully comprehensible within our current scientific framework. More concerning is the apparent agenda behind the Whitmore's wellness retreats and their selective distribution of water from the well. Recent public records indicate that since 2021, the Whitmores have established a nonprofit organization called the Watershed Fellowship, ostensibly dedicated to water conservation and the exploration of hydrotherapeutic traditions. Their application for tax-exempt status describes activities including meditation retreats, historical research, and the preservation of ancient water-related practices indigenous to New England. While seemingly innocuous, the organization's financial disclosures reveal concerning patterns. The pattern suggests a deliberate effort to identify receptive individuals and gradually integrate them into some form of community centered around the well's influence. Substantial donations have been made by participants in their retreats, with several individuals making contributions in excess of $50,000 after attending multiple sessions. More tellingly, the organization has purchased 7 additional properties in Salem, over the past 18 months, all located above what Dr. Petrovsky's incomplete survey identified as major junctions in the subterranean channel network. Building permits filed for these properties include plans for hydrological access points and meditation spaces, suggesting an expansion of whatever activities are centered at the original Adams well. Construction at these sites has been conducted exclusively by non-local contractors, with work often performed at night, behind privacy screens that prevent observation. Perhaps most troubling is the Fellowship's recent recruitment efforts, targeting individuals with specific professional backgrounds: hydrogeologists, chemical engineers, deep-sea extraction specialists, and experts in advanced filtration technologies. Job postings describe positions focused on revolutionary water processing methods and exploration of untapped aquifer resources, offering exceptional compensation but requiring extensive non-disclosure agreements. A potential answer may lie in the most recent development: a permit application filed by the Watershed Fellowship with the Salem Planning Commission in August 2023, requesting approval for what is described as a research facility dedicated to the study and application of naturally occurring biochemical compounds found in deep aquifer sources beneath historic Salem. The application, which runs to over 300 pages of technical specifications, proposes a facility extending 5 stories below ground, with a surface structure designed to resemble a traditional New England water treatment plant. Buried within the dense technical language are references to extraction and refinement of compounds with significant potential for human enhancement and stabilization of symbiotic molecular structures capable of cellular integration. More alarming are the security specifications, which include measures typically associated with biosafety level 4 facilities, handling the most dangerous known pathogens: airlocks, negative pressure systems, chemical showers, and incineration. Capabilities for all waste products. The pattern suggests a systematic effort to expand whatever operation began at the Adams property, combining elements of a cult-like wellness movement with serious scientific and engineering expertise. The question remains, to what ultimate purpose? The application justifies these measures as standard precautions for handling sensitive organic compounds susceptible to contamination, but the level of containment suggested exceeds typical requirements for water treatment by several orders of magnitude. The Commission has delayed ruling on this application pending environmental impact studies, but internal emails obtained through public records requests show that several commissioners have expressed concerns about both the scale of the proposed facility and the vagueness surrounding its actual purpose. Before we approve anything of this magnitude, we need significantly more transparency about the end products and their intended use. A response from Commissioner James Whitmore, relation to Richard Whitmore, unconfirmed but likely, urged approval in the interest of economic development and scientific advancement, suggesting that excessive regulatory caution could drive this promising research to more accommodating municipalities. As this recording is made, the matter remains undecided, with public hearings scheduled for next month. The Watershed Fellowship continues its wellness retreats and property acquisitions, while the original Adams Well, now the centerpiece of the Whitmore Rose Garden, continues to draw visitors seeking what promotional materials describe as transformation through the waters of deepest knowing. Whether these developments represent the benign rediscovery of some natural resource with unusual properties, or something far more sinister, a modern continuation of whatever claimed Thaddeus and Josephine Adams more than a century ago, remains to be determined. Commissioner Eleanor Reynolds wrote to her colleagues on September 12th. The technical language obscures rather than clarifies what they actually intend to do with whatever they're extracting from these aquifers. But the pattern is clear. Beneath Salem's historic streets, something flows that defies conventional understanding, something that has influenced the city's development for centuries, periodically rising to the surface before receding again into darkness. For those who value their autonomy of mind and body, the recommendation is clear. Should you find yourself in Salem, admire the historic architecture, enjoy the maritime museums, even tour the witch trial memorials if you must. But if you're offered water from a private well, particularly one on Chestnut Street, politely but firmly decline. Some thirsts are better left unquenched. Some depths, once opened, can never be truly sealed again.